Before proceeding, viewers are advised to exercise caution. The following is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim reproduction of testimony in federal court in the case of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. Everything was proceeding as usual. The trial of Diddy was dragging on. Tedious formalities, monotonous speeches, sleepy faces of the jury, and routine phrases from the lawyers, who were no longer attempting to surprise anyone. Reporters sat with their phones, some lazily tapping away at their laptops, others poking at plastic cups of cold coffee. It felt as if everyone had long since grown tired of the proceedings and expected nothing new, let alone anything exciting, to happen today. A sluggish, lethargic atmosphere reigned in the hall. People whispered to each other, security guards loitered at the doors, some checked their email, others simply yawned. It all resembled a poorly rehearsed play in which the actors themselves did not believe in their roles. There was no tension, no drama, just another day in a protracted court spectacle. But then he suddenly appeared. Jim Carrey. Yes, the very same Jim Carrey you're used to seeing with his crazy facial expressions and trademark grin. Only on this day, everything was different. No one was expecting him. His name was not on any official witness list, in any preliminary reports, or in any journalist predictions. Not a hint. So when he showed up, the journalists were stunned. Everyone was busy with their notebooks, smartphones, and coffee from vending machines when suddenly the doors swung open and he walked into the courtroom. No noise, no smiles. Jim Carrey walked confidently, as if his appearance there was part of a plan that everyone had forgotten about. He was wearing a long black coat, sunglasses hid his eyes, and his face was completely serious, almost stony. There was no trace of the frivolous grimace that millions had grown accustomed to. Silence fell instantly. The audience, the judge, the security guards, the reporters, everyone stopped breathing. The atmosphere in the hall seemed to change. The air became thicker. There was a feeling that something important and strange was about to happen. People looked at each other, trying to understand. What is he doing here? What does Carrey have to do with this? And why didn't anyone warn us? No one had any answers at the time. Only the feeling that a new, unexpected chapter in this already absurd and confusing case had begun. Carrey begins to speak, quietly, almost in a whisper, as if afraid that someone is listening to his words. His voice trembles. His sentences are punctuated by pauses, as if every word is coming with effort. This is no longer an actor, a show, or a character. This is a man who is clearly going through something serious. The room falls silent again, so much so that you can hear someone in the corner holding their breath. He says that throughout his career he has participated in rituals. And this is not the magic of red carpets and golden statuettes. No, he calls them disturbing, humiliating, frightening. He doesn't go into details, but his tone is such that it makes you feel uncomfortable. He doesn't make excuses or play to the audience. He just tells it like it is. Then he pauses, and suddenly declares that he didn't become successful solely because of his talent, not because of his charisma, his brilliant facial expressions, or his ability to transform himself. No. He became Jim Carrey because he submitted. He submitted to someone who, according to him, was actually in control. And then he names the person, Diddy. He says it without emotion, calmly, but a chill runs through the room. Carrey claims that Diddy was allegedly behind many processes, that he allegedly controlled not only the industry but also the fates of the people in it. It sounds like something out of a paranoid thriller. But there is no sarcasm in Carrey's voice, not even a hint of a joke. He speaks as a witness, not as an artist. And it becomes clear that whatever this is, it is no longer just a performance. Carrey continues his speech, and his voice becomes even quieter, almost muffled, as if he is afraid that even the air around him will hear these words. He describes the so-called initiation, a ritual that, in his words, was a turning point in his life and career. He begins with how he was forced to sit in a bathtub filled with ice water. Imagine the cold so intense that your body stiffens, your muscles cramp, and your breathing becomes sharp and labored. This is not just a test of endurance. It is a symbolic act that was supposed to break down internal barriers and prepare him for a new life. Candles burned around the tub, creating a strange, oppressive atmosphere that resembled a scene from some secret ritual or cult ceremony. In the darkness, illuminated only by the soft flickering light of the candles, stood people, influential, powerful figures whose faces he did not name. but who were among the elite of Hollywood. These were not just random guests or fans. They were, in his words, the people who held the reins of power and the destinies of many artists in their hands. Carrey does not mention any direct crimes. There is no description of violence or obvious illegal actions. Instead, he talks about moral and psychological enslavement, a state in which a person feels like a prisoner who is forced to give up their will, their self. He seems to be saying that he found himself in a system where choice is an illusion and success depends not on talent or hard work, but on agreeing to obey the rules and those who dictate them. The story sounds like a spiritual confession rather than legal testimony. He does not make accusations or try to prove anything specific in court. He simply shares his experiences and pain. His voice sometimes breaks, and his eyes flash with fatigue and regret, as if the years of silence and hidden secrets are weighing heavily on him. This was not a show or a performance. It was a moment when a person opened up in a way he had never allowed himself to before, and it was hard to listen to. Because it was a story about how a celebrity whom everyone was used to laughing at and admiring suddenly found himself in a trap from which it was not so easy to escape. Carrey goes on to tell how it all began. According to him, he first started receiving invitations to private parties, the kind that ordinary people can hardly ever get into. These parties were not just social events, but a kind of exclusive club for the select few, where influential people from the world of show business and Hollywood gathered. One day, he was taken to a mansion in the hills, a large house overlooking the city surrounded by luxurious gardens and security guards. He later learned that the house belonged to Diddy, although at the time it was just another place where the in-crowd gathered. The atmosphere there was tense and mysterious. Everything around him was steeped in power and hidden rules. In this house, according to him, he was forced to undergo a so-called purification ritual. He describes it as a strange and humiliating process. A bathtub filled with ice water was not just a cold test, but a symbolic ritual in which he had to purify himself, shed his old self to become new. And this bath was special. Sean Combs, aka Diddy, was there with him. They sat side by side, like participants in some kind of ritual that was more like a test of obedience. But it didn't end there. After the bath, Carrey had to answer personal questions. Questions that, as he says, went far beyond the scope of a normal interview or friendly conversation. These questions were so deep and intrusive that it felt like they were trying to figure him out, to uncover his weaknesses and secrets so they could use them against him. Finally, he says, he had to wash Diddy's back. He describes this act as a symbol of submission, a sign that he was willing to accept the rules of the game and do whatever it took to make it big. Carrey emphasizes that all this was presented as the last step, as if without this ritual there would be no future, no success. And for him, he says, it was the moment when he realized that success in Hollywood is not only about talent, but also about willingness to go through such trials. Carrey admits that he submitted. He says he did it not out of desire, not out of love for acting or for the pleasure of it, but because he simply saw no other way out. It seemed to him that if he refused, the doors to the industry would close forever. It was a choice between career and freedom, and he chose career, or even if it meant sacrificing a part of himself. After that strange ritual, when he submitted and accepted all these trials, he went out into the room and found the script for the movie The Cable Guy. At first glance, it was an ordinary script, nothing special, but next to it was a note. "Welcome to a new level." These words became a symbol for him of a transition to another reality, a new world where success is measured not only by talent, but also by the degree of submission to the system. He calls this moment a turning point, the beginning of a new chapter in his life. But at the same time, it was also the moment when his inner self was destroyed. According to him, a part of him, the real and free part, remained somewhere there in the past. Now he was not just an actor, but a person who had gone through something that changed him forever. For Carrey, it wasn't just a step up the career ladder. It was a price he paid, losing part of his identity in order to get where he was. That's why he remembers that moment with such heaviness and pain. Because success came at the cost of inner destruction and the loss of freedom of choice. Carrey candidly admits that since then, he has lived with a heavy sense of shame that weighs him down and gives him no peace. He explains that although there was no direct physical abuse, that doesn't make the situation any easier. On the contrary, what happened to him was much more sophisticated. It was pressure, subtle and hidden, psychological coercion disguised as voluntary participation. He says that it looked as if he had chosen this path himself, that he had agreed to the rituals and rules, but in reality it was a trap from which it was difficult to escape. Such pressure works subtly, breaking down a person's inner boundaries and forcing them to obey without any visible use of force. Carrey emphasizes that this invisible control and manipulation left a deep mark on his soul. He lives with this burden, with this shame that haunts him and prevents him from feeling free. And although he may appear successful and confident on the outside, inside he continues to struggle in a way that few can understand. Carrey begins to talk about the sinister parties that became part of that hidden life that almost no one knows about. These events were not just attended by celebrities. Movie stars, top models, famous athletes, directors, and other influential people from the industry. But it was far from the usual glamorous setting of red carpets and cameras. Instead, it was shrouded in secrecy and control. He describes how all guests had their phones taken away at the entrance. No photos, no calls, no contact with the outside world. Everyone had to sign strict non-disclosure agreements that hung over them like a threat. The house where these parties took place was turned into a veritable labyrinth. A maze of closed rooms, narrow corridors, dim candlelight, and quiet but ominous music that made you feel like you had entered another dimension with its own rules and secrets. For newcomers like Carrey, it was all particularly scary and confusing. They were offered pills to take, not just for fun, but as if it were a choice on which much depended. Someone said something to him then that he would never forget. Choose your night. It sounded like an invitation to something that was both alluring and frightening, where you had to decide what path you would take and what you were willing to accept for it. This story sounds like a dark fairy tale with a touch of horror, where instead of princes and fairies there are secret games, power and manipulation, and people's fates are decided behind closed doors, in the dark, and to the sound of unfamiliar music. He says that despite the pressure and offers, he refused to take the pills, the drugs he was offered. But he didn't leave. He stayed because he knew that leaving meant losing everything. His career, his chance at success, his opportunities. For him, it was a moment when fear and hope fought inside him. Fear of leaving and being left behind forever. Hope that everything would somehow work out. He watched as other guests were gradually led into closed rooms. Some came out looking excited, as if they had experienced something desirable or thrilling. Others looked frightened and depressed, as if they had encountered something completely different, something they didn't like and feared. The atmosphere was tense and unpredictable. When Carrey asked what was going on, he received a simple and cryptic reply. "This is the second act." These words sounded like an invitation to the next, darker and more serious part of the evening, like a play where everything is just beginning, and the real events are yet to come. But for those who were there for the first time, it was a frightening, incomprehensible, and harsh experience that left deep scars on their souls. Jim Carrey continued his story with a heavy heart and noticeable pain in his voice, as if the memories he was sharing were still alive and cutting him from the inside. He described a scene that, in his words, was particularly painful and indicative of the atmosphere at Sean Combs' private parties. According to him, at one of these parties, a young woman, barely 20 years old, suddenly ran out of one of the dark rooms of the mansion. She was in complete emotional despair. Her face was covered in tears, her lips were trembling, and she was clutching her dress tightly in her hands as if it were her last support in a world that had suddenly become unbearable for her. She cried openly without fear of being heard, and she looked as if she had just experienced something terrible and traumatic. But here comes the most terrifying part. Despite the woman's obvious suffering, no one around her moved toward her, no one tried to help her, no one showed the slightest bit of compassion. The entire room, all of these influential and famous people, seemed to have received an unspoken order to pretend that nothing was happening. No one turned around, no one said a word, no one even glanced in her direction. It was as if there was a silent agreement to ignore the pain and suffering in order to preserve the illusion they had created. Carrey said that the atmosphere in the house was cold and soulless. It was a place where suffering was considered a distraction from the show, where pain and weakness were seen as a violation of the delicate, fragile fabric of the world they had created. A world of glamour, power, and control. Any emotion that could destroy this illusion was suppressed by silence and indifference. He emphasized that this indifference seemed to him more frightening than any open violence. Because ignoring someone else's pain when you could help was a form of cruelty that caused a feeling of complete isolation and loneliness. For those who found themselves there, it was like being trapped in a place where you were not only traumatized, but also forced to remain silent and suffer alone. Carrey said that this scene left a deep impression on him, and it was moments like these that revealed the true face of those parties, not glamorous and attractive, but dark, cold, and cruel, where power and control were achieved through fear and oppression. Jim Carrey continued his story with even more tension and bitterness. He recalled how he once walked into one of the back rooms of the mansion, one of those hidden from prying eyes. There he saw a scene that shocked him to the core. A famous comedian was lying on the couch unconscious, as if completely disconnected from reality. He seemed helpless, unable to control himself or the situation. But the most terrible thing was that 3 men and a woman were standing around him. Instead of helping, they were laughing and taking pictures as if the situation were some kind of game or entertainment. This behavior seemed absurd and inhumane to Carrey, as if another person's suffering had become a source of amusement. Meanwhile, Diddy himself, the man Carrey described as the key figure in these events, moved around the house like a ghostly host. He didn't linger in any room or engage in conversation, but his presence was palpable everywhere. Carrey described him as more than just a man, as an observer and controller who made sure that all the right people did exactly what was expected of them, often wrong and cruel things. At that moment, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Every word Carrey uttered sounded like a sentence, and no one dared to interrupt. He concluded his story, and his words sounded like a thunderclap. This was not a party, it was a ceremony. And the price of admission was your conscience. These words left everyone in the courtroom stunned, because they revealed the full depth and seriousness of what was happening. This was not just entertainment or a party, but a dark ritual where the price was one's own soul and moral boundaries. But Jim Carrey didn't stop there. He gripped the edges of the podium tightly, as if preparing to take a decisive leap into the abyss, and his whole demeanor spoke of tension and inner struggle. His voice became even firmer, and his words even more weighty. He said that everything he saw at these parties and events ultimately boiled down to one person, Diddy. All the events, every meeting, every deal, every action were like threads woven around him. Carrey emphasized that these were not random gatherings or just parties. It was a carefully constructed system, and Diddy was its center and driving force. He said that these parties had been going on for years, repeating the same scenario. The atmosphere was always the same: closed doors, strict secrecy, strict rules. The participants were always the same people: models, producers, actors, managers, people who had either already achieved success or were on the verge of a big breakthrough. But most importantly, Carrey noted, it was those who were just starting to rise, who were vulnerable and dependent on those who already had power, who were caught in this web. Young and ambitious people striving to reach the top of the industry became the main target. They did not yet have freedom and independence, and those who ran the whole system took advantage of this. It was not just cruel, it was cold and calculated control over the lives of people who dreamed of a great career. He recalled how, back in 2001, he brought a colleague to one of these private parties. He didn't name him, but noted that the man's face was familiar to anyone who watched comedy even a little. In other words, he was someone quite well known and recognizable in the entertainment world. According to Carrey, this colleague left the party in the middle of the evening. That is, he couldn't take it and left before things got to the darkest and most terrifying moments. A few years after that incident, he wrote a message to Jim thanking him for not trying to stop him or make him stay. The message contained a very profound and disturbing phrase: "Thank you for not stopping me. I was on the verge of losing my soul." This admission spoke to how dangerous and destructive those events were. This man had almost lost himself, his essence, his identity, his moral compass, and leaving that party was his salvation. For Carrey, this episode was a stark reminder of how fragile the line between success and self-destruction can be, and how important it is to make the right choice at the right time, despite pressure and temptation. Jim Carrey then moved on to the darker and more sinister side of these events. He said that these parties weren't just about having fun or hanging out. They were places where people were being watched and information was being gathered. Every step, every word, every action of the guests was carefully monitored and analyzed. Some people managed to play the role that the hosts expected of them, while others tried to be too honest or open. And that didn't go unnoticed either. He said that the entire process was under strict control, as if invisible rules and cameras were at work at these events, recording everything that happened. Carrey even mentioned one of the executives of a major studio who regularly attended such parties. According to him, this person didn't come just for fun, he was there to observe, and sometimes left with recorded documents, contracts, or other important information. It looked like a secret operation, hidden from the public eye, where people's fates and future deals were decided. Carrey emphasized that real agreements and deals in the industry were rarely made in traditional offices or meeting rooms. Much more often, decisive moments took place in the bedrooms and closed rooms of those very parties, where power and control intertwined with manipulation and psychological pressure. It was there that careers were decided in the shadows, far from the eyes of the public and the law. One of the most disturbing episodes Carrey described happened in 2003 at one of these penthouse parties. He watched as a well-known director, a man with a big name and influence, took a young performer, who clearly looked frightened and confused, by the arm and led him into one of the private rooms. This young man had just signed his first contract and, according to Carrey, was on the verge of a big career breakthrough. What was particularly painful for Carrey was that no one, including himself, intervened in the situation. Everyone present, as if paralyzed or bound by an invisible rule of silence, looked the other way. Jim admitted that he lived with a heavy sense of guilt for a long time because he didn't try to help the young man. At the time, he justified his inaction by thinking, that's just the way the world is. He believed it was simply part of the industry, part of the rules of the game that you had to accept if you wanted to succeed. But now, years later, and having gone through this experience, he realizes that this was a lie. The world shouldn't be like this. The world shouldn't allow such things to happen and go unpunished. This realization was a kind of revelation for him, an understanding that silence and acquiescence to such rules do not make a person better, but only exacerbate the injustice and pain that people around them experience. The courtroom seemed to freeze in place, as if time itself had stopped. The atmosphere was so tense and profound that it no longer resembled a normal court proceeding. Rather, it was more like a final, candid conversation, as if facing eternity. Everyone present felt that they were hearing not just testimony, but a confession that could change everything. Jim Carrey finally decided to say what he had been holding inside for so long. I don't want to be an accomplice anymore. These words sounded not just like a confession, but like a desperate cry from the soul. He admitted that he was tired of constantly playing the role of the cheerful and carefree guy in interviews, tired of pretending not to notice the dark side lurking behind the scenes. By devil, he meant Sean Combs, the man behind all this horror who controlled the situation. The reaction in the courtroom was strong. Some people sat in complete shock, and one of the jurors couldn't hold back her tears. Sensing the tension, the judge suggested taking a break so everyone could compose themselves, but Carrey firmly refused. He said he wanted to finish his statement right then and there without delay. He explained that he had remained silent all these years not because he was afraid to speak, but because he thought he was going crazy. It was precisely this feeling, he said, that had been imposed on him, a feeling of madness that had forced him to remain silent. He went through many years of inner struggle, hiding behind the smile he showed the public after his successful films. Bruce Almighty, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, and always say yes. Outwardly, he seemed happy and successful, but at home he could sit in silence for hours, staring at the wall, realizing the price he had paid for his success. These words made everyone think about how behind the bright lights and smiles of celebrities, there is often a difficult, painful inner world full of pain, fear, and moral compromises. When Jim tried to broach the subject with others, agents, therapists, close friends, he was mostly met with indifference or even warnings. In response to his stories, he heard things like, "That's how it is," or "Better not dig too deep, it's dangerous." These words were like a wall, pushing him away and causing him to withdraw into himself. Over time, these experiences began to manifest themselves on a physical and psychological level. He began to have nightmares, suffer from hallucinations, and wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. His mind tried to understand, had he chosen this path himself? Had he consciously agreed to these horrors? But when he heard similar stories from other people like Cassie Ventura and Monique, it became clear to him that this was not a personal weakness or mistake, but a deliberate, systematic manipulation. They were all made to feel crazy, to doubt themselves in order to maintain control and silence. This, according to Carrey, is how the entire industry works, surviving through suppression and fear. He admitted that he had remained silent for many years out of fear of losing everything, his career, his friends, his support, and being left alone with this horror when no one would believe him. But now, after everything he had been through, he no longer felt that fear. A dead silence hung in the courtroom as if the room itself had ceased to be a normal courtroom. Carrey continued, "There is an unspoken list, not written down on paper but known to all. It is a list of those who always showed up at these private parties, who remained silent when the horrors took place, who openly or secretly defended Diddy because they were defending themselves first and foremost. This list is like a taboo, like an invisible network that keeps the entire industry in check and forces everyone to keep the truth quiet." He didn't name names right away, but started with descriptions, as if painting portraits of those involved in the system. There was a director who showed up at all these private events as if it were his second job, a manager who brought new people there as if luring them into a trap. There were stars with a reputation for being saints, people who were respected and looked up to by everyone, but they always appeared at the right moment when no one was looking, as if they were part of something secret. Gradually, he began to speak more specifically. For example, an actor who is loved for his roles as strong, positive characters was a regular guest at these private parties. A popular talk show host who personally saw one of the dancers become ill. But none of those present even called a doctor, as if nothing unusual had happened. And a producer who brought in new people and did so as part of a deal. Keep quiet, and you'll be allowed to continue. But the most important thing was what Carrey said. This list was not compiled by some outsider, it was compiled by Diddy himself. He didn't just use the system, he created it and held it in his hands. It was he who, with signs and hints, showed who could be trusted, who was one of us in this game, and who was an outsider. It was like a ritual, an initiation into a closed club where only the chosen few could enter, but at a very high price. Jim recalled one of the most terrifying scenes that took place in 2005, when he was given a VIP card to one of the parties. On the upper floors of the penthouse were rooms where guests wore masks, not for fashion, but to preserve their anonymity. There were 5 celebrities standing there, with Diddy in the center, like a conductor watching, choosing, and deciding people's fates. Jim said that the higher the floor, the lower the morals, adding that nothing was accidental here. Everything was part of a system, and Diddy was its chief executive. After that, he paused for a long time. The judge was about to suggest a break, but Carrey spoke again, already on the verge of tears. "This is the hardest part," he said, "because it sounds crazy, but it's true." He leaned forward, his voice quiet and sincere. "In this city, you don't become famous without going through a breakdown. Maybe not physical, but psychological, spiritual. They have to remake you in their image, make you convenient, controllable." He recalled how these traumas accumulated inside him, like a heavy burden that became more unbearable with each passing day. Panic attacks, self-hatred, moments when he seemed to slip out of reality, dissociation that is not something people talk about openly. He talked about how he would smile and laugh on set, and then go to his trailer and cry alone, trying to hide the pain from everyone. He admitted that at one point after the 2007 film The Number 23, he seriously considered suicide. At the time, he felt that success came at too high a price. He said that he saw a photo taken at a party when he was high, and in the mirror he saw a complete stranger, himself, but without a soul or light. That's when he realized that he was no longer living, just surviving. At that moment, the courtroom fell silent. The prosecution did not utter a word, no one objected. Jim spoke for an entire generation, people who had gone through this and remained silent. He finished in a whisper. "They took my laughter. They took my light." He added that he didn't want Diddy to go to prison for what he had done to him personally, but for what he had done to all of us, or to everyone who had fallen into this trap. He described Hollywood as a kind of parasite that feeds on the dreams and hopes of young people. In this system, talent doesn't matter. They don't give you a career based on your abilities. They only give you the illusion of success. And then they watch to see how far you're willing to go to keep that illusion and not lose what they gave you, but in return they took a part of you.